Okay. There are a couple of things we have to do right after the presentation this time around. So we want to go straight into it. That we had the icebreaker, and we have a few announcements to run later. So let me not take up much of your time. Again, honestly, there was going to be a short technical shutdown. I'm trying to avoid it. That's why we're buying time. But we're all set and good to go. I would like to do the honors of calling our test speaker, facilitator for the day. It's no other on the session defining our user needs and value proposition. The support is here.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to our afternoon session. Oh, it looks like we're over our technical difficulties. So I'm Paul Tessier. I'm part of the Summit team along with Eric and Jenna and Mike. You having a tough time hearing me? Is that better? Okay. And I'm going to be talking to you this afternoon about user needs and value proposition. Actually, before I do that, I'll give you a little bit of my background. So I've been in the medical products field now for over 40 years, brought dozens of medical products to market of all different types, some physical devices, some services, some software. I've done 3 startup companies over that period of time, and for the last 10 years, I've been working with this great group in the translational research space. So we're going to talk about 6 different points here this afternoon. We're going to talk about understanding your customer, one of the absolute most important things you can do, and where that's particularly hard in healthcare in many cases. We're going to talk about de-risking the market. There was a question, I think, over here about risk earlier, and we're going to help you minimize risk. We're going to talk about de-risking your market, understanding users versus buyers, something you may not have heard about before. That's a very important distinction. And then we'll do a little bit on value proposition following that. So why do startups fail? I think Eric mentioned that in his presentation. Does anyone remember? No one remembers that? Why do you think startups fail? Why do you think 80% of startups fail? Only 20% make it. Anybody have any ideas? What leads to that? Yep, they don't have a plan. That's certainly one. Others? I usually hear about money, lack of finances. Please, go ahead.
Yes, most startup fails because they are not ready to start.
They're not ready to start. Okay, we'll take one more and then we'll move on.
Yeah, I think most startups fail because they fail to plan for their risks that they will encounter through the business process.
Yep. Okay, I'm gonna stop there. We could keep going on. There's a long list actually, and this is a list from a company called CB Insights. They survey startup companies, and this is from 100 companies that failed that they surveyed, and I blocked out the #1 reason. So these are the follow-on ones: running out of money, bad product, etc. But the #1 reason is no market need. They brought the wrong product to market. Customers don't want it. So even if the product was great and a well-established company was put in place, if nobody wants your product, if there's no market, then you're in trouble. So the bottom line is, for most entrepreneurs, they don't know their customer and they don't really know what the customer wants. It's surprising. You may think you do, but perhaps at the end of this discussion here this afternoon, you're going to realize you need to do more customer validation. And that's one of the biggest differences between an existing company and a startup company is knowing your customer. So an existing company has customers, they're building their customer base, they're growing their company. It's really an execution play. Startup companies are in the search mode. They need to go out, understand customer needs. They need to do what's called customer discovery. Then, and only after that, do you come up with ideas and go out and validate those with customers. And frequently, and actually most companies end up pivoting. So the original idea that you had for your company may not be the product you end up going to market with. Does that surprise people? Have you heard about pivoting, changing direction? A lot of startup companies pivot more than once. They may pivot 2 or 3 times, but that's not the important thing. The important thing is to end up in the right place with the right product for the market. So what do most startup companies do? They typically start with a product. Everybody's so excited, their new startup. It may be, the product could be a service, as Mike Dempsey had mentioned previously, or it could be a physical thing. But most people start with a product. They need to get that product done. They need to go out and hype it, show it, try to sell it to customers. They do market risk reduction later. And to that point that somebody mentioned earlier about risk, the way you reduce risk of entrepreneurship and the way you increase your chance of success and end up in that 20% instead of the 80% is to reduce your market risk. Market risk is number 1. So market de-risking, the absolute most important thing for a startup, and therefore the most important thing for you aspiring entrepreneurs, to really understand that market risk and knowing your customers is your number 1 job. So what's involved with market de-risking? So first of all, who's the customer? Second of all, what are their problems and needs? So you really want to understand problems. Businesses solve problems. They meet needs for customers. That's how you create value, and that's what's important. That's what people buy. And then you need to understand the buying process. There are different processes used, different decision criteria. So you need to meet a need that fits with the buying process. Then you want to understand your unique benefits. What are your benefits over the competition? How do you position yourself to stand out? And then, of course, there's a point of, in general, understanding the market, understanding the competition. But first of all and foremost, you can see here that it's really customers that are important. So you see the word customer in most of these statements. So you really got to get out there, talk with people, understand your customers. And ideally, you do that before you have a product. That may sound strange, but in some ways you're better off having an idea or an early draft of a product, an early concept. Get out there and find out what the customer needs. Is that the right thing? Is that really what they need, what they want? And it's easier then to change your idea than it is when you're further along, you've invested in it, and you're hesitant to change. So it may seem like a silly question, but who are your customers? And in healthcare, there are frequently multiple customers. And there's a difference between users and buyers very frequently. We're going to talk a little bit about that, and I'll give you some examples. And you're going to need a compelling value proposition for both of those groups, primarily the buyer, and we'll talk more about that as well. So the focus should be on who pays you, right? Who's the economic buyer? What do they need and want, and what are their purchase decisions? So focus on the buyer. Okay, so we're going to go through a few examples here of buyers and users. So as an example, we'll say there's a product or service that's for patient care. And let's say our first market is going to be a clinic. So your product is going to be sold to a clinic used in patient care. So who do you think the user is? Anybody have an idea of who the user would be for that product? Did I hear it? No? Nobody? I'm sorry? The clinician. Yes. So it's going to be the care provider. that's going to use the product. It's a product for patient care. Who's the buyer, do you think? Anybody have an idea of who the buyer is? It could be the patient, but because this is a clinic, you're selling the product to the clinic to deliver to the patient. The buyer is most likely the clinic owner, right? So the owner is going to need to be the one who makes the final decision and pays you, but you also need to have a product that's useful to the clinician. Okay, second example here. Now you're providing care directly. So maybe you have a clinic or you have a pharmacy and the customer is a patient, or the person you're treating is a patient, and they have insurance. Now I know that's not real common here in Liberia, but for the sake of argument, this patient has insurance when they go in. So in this case, who's the user? I'm sorry? Actually, the insurance company comes later. The user is the patient because you're providing the service to the patient, the product or service. So the patient's the user, but you're right that the insurance company, the insurance provider, is the buyer. They're the paying customer. And they have to cover your service to the patient. Then the patient needs to choose you as a service provider. Okay, last example. Now there's a patient who is self-paying. So it's paying out of pocket. So who's the user and who's the buyer in this case? So the patient is the user, and in this case, because they're paying out of pocket, correct, they're also the buyer. So just a few examples here of really understanding who's the user, who's the buyer. So understanding customers, Mike Dempsey likes to say, is a contact sport. You got to get out there and connect with people. You need to speak to a lot of customers, more than you ever thought you would talk to. So in our class, we ask students to talk to at least 100 people. That may seem like a lot, I don't know. But until you start to get opinions from that number of people, you don't really have a good understanding. In addition to the users and buyers, there are going to be some other people that you want to talk to. And some of the principles that I'm going to talk about later apply to them as well, but we're going to focus on users and buyers. But you may have important vendors that you need to talk to. You may have distributors that distribute and help you distribute and sell your product. So there may be a number of what we call stakeholders, a variety of stakeholders that you're going to need to speak to. There's actually an art to interviewing customers. It's more than sitting down and chatting. In some ways it is sitting down and chatting, but it's important the way you chat, how you address the customer and the type of questions you ask. There's a really good book here, Talking to Humans, and there's a link. I don't know, we can provide that to you with some follow-up information as well. But it's a great book to go through. It'll give you more insights. Okay, we're going to talk about the rules of interviewing. There's actually 9 of them. There's a fair bit of overlap. They kind of interrelate. We can talk some about that, but I think it's good to go through them all and understand them. But before we do that, I just want to talk a little bit about the importance of these rules. Why are these important? So, customer interviewing is essentially market research. This is the key way, the primary way you de-risk your market. And like any type of research, if you don't do it correctly, the results can be wrong, they can be useless, or even worse, they can be misleading. They can head you in the wrong direction. So you really want to be careful and do this properly. How many people here have done science experiments in a lab? Has anybody ever done bacterial cultures or anything like that? Nobody. Okay, so maybe this wasn't a great example to use. But when you're doing a bacterial culture, you start out with a petri dish. You add in a culture medium. something that helps that bacteria grow. Then you put it into incubate, and you need to set the temperature. Okay. In addition to the temperature, you need to think about how long you need to incubate for, right? So in that process, if you get those things wrong, and actually any one of those things wrong, your result is going to be improper. And it's really, in many ways, no different when you're talking to customers. All right, so we're going to go through the 9 rules. So rule number 1, we like to call the no ice cream questions. If you were to ask somebody, would you like an ice cream? Most often, the answer is going to be, sure, that sounds good. I'd love to have an ice cream. But the answer to the question, would you like this ice cream and it costs $100 US, guess what? I think you're going to get a very different answer, right? The answer is going to be no. There's no way I'm paying $100 for an ice cream, right? So what happened here? What happened is the question states potential benefits without stating the cost or some of the negatives associated with achieving that benefit. So if you're going to ask this type of question, you need to fully provide information to the customer, and you don't want to ask ice cream questions. Okay, rule number 2, pull, don't push. So remember, the goal of interviewing customers is to understand their needs, to understand their problems, right? You need to listen to do that. And you need to pull information from them. You can't push ideas onto them. So a few examples here of push versus pull. So everyone agrees that X is a problem. Don't you agree? How is that a push? It's a push because you're basically saying that everyone else agrees. They're foolish not to agree, and then you're asking them if they do. So chances are they're going to say yes, whether they do or not, right? Another push kind of question. We have the best solution for X. X may be. And here's why we think it's better. Would you use it? Again, a push statement, right? I'm already telling you this is a better product. We have the best solution. And rather than saying, would you use it, we're saying, how would you use it? The assumption is you would use it to begin with. That's a push question. You're making the assumption, you're pushing the answer onto them. So what you really want to do is focus on pulling. You want to ask questions like, what worries you the most? Maybe it's a clinic owner. You want to ask them, what worries you? What keeps you up at night is an expression we use in the United States. Right? It's an open-ended question that solicits information from the interviewee to you in a way that expresses their needs and their problems. You may ask, what's the hardest part of your day? Most people would like their day to be easier, right? You understand what's hard, you come up with a way to do it easier, you've just met a need. And there's some other questions here. I won't go through them all, but I think these are good examples of push versus pull. Okay, rule number 3, no leading questions. This is a very interesting one. It kind of gets to psychology in some ways and subconscious thinking. But there was an interesting study done where they asked a group of people, do you get headaches frequently? And if so, how often? And the response from that group was just over 2 headaches a week. They then asked a very similar question to a second group of people with like backgrounds, right? There was no real difference between the groups. And it said, do you get headaches occasionally? And if so, how often? And it reported less than 1 a week. So 3 times, 1/3. right? And why was that? The only difference between these two is the word frequently and the word occasionally. So that's what a leading question is. They're giving them a context, and that leads them to a conclusion. So you want to leave that out. You would say, do you get headaches? And if so, how often? If you say frequently, occasionally, do you rarely get headaches? It's going to influence their response to you. And they don't even realize it's happening. It's sort of a subconscious thing. It's human nature. So you really want to avoid that to get the best answers. Okay, so I think we already talked about this. You've suggested the answer by phrasing the question, something you don't want to do. Remember, from the previous rule, you want to pull information out of them. So you want to make sure it's open-ended, they can answer freely, and pull that information. Okay, rule number 4, past behavior versus future behavior. So if I ask somebody, how many times are you going to exercise next year? Their response might be, gee, I'm going to exercise probably 3 times a week. I'm going to do that every week, right? So great intentions. That's future behavior that they're predicting. If you ask somebody, how many times a week have you been exercising? That same person may say, gee, 0. I haven't been. So this is an example of past behavior and future behavior. People would like to think they're going to do better in the future. Things are going to change. But it's very difficult. Change is not an easy thing for people. It's actually pretty rare that people change their behavior. It can happen, but it takes time. You don't want to count on that with your product. It increases your risk. People may not use it or buy it. So the best predictor of what people are going to do in the future is what they've done in the past. So keep that in mind. Ask them to describe things that they have been doing. Okay, actual self versus ideal self. Kind of similar to the previous one. A little subtle difference. So if you ask somebody, can you describe your diet? Oh, gee, I eat mostly healthy foods, a lot of fish and vegetables and nuts and other healthy foods. If instead you said, can you describe your last meal? You may get a very different answer. Well, gee, I was heading to an event, I was running late, I just grabbed a slice of pizza, and then later on after the event, I had a hot dog, right? Very different. There's no fish, fruit, or nuts in that, right? So this is a great example of the actual self versus ideal self. So just like people on the previous question, in the future would like to think they can do things differently, people kid themselves in the present as well, right? People like to think of themselves as being in a more ideal situation than what they really are. So you really want to ask them a story about the last time. You want to get them to talk about what happened. That'll give you a much better perspective on what they're going to do. Okay, rule number 6, no pitching. Very difficult for entrepreneurs not to do. But remember, this is customer discovery. The whole purpose of this is to understand their problems, their needs, and then understand if you have a solution for that that would be saleable. If you go in and you pitch, it's going to predispose them. You're going to violate a number of other rules that we'll get to in a second. So if you were to ask somebody, gee, my clinic is friendly, it's easy to get to, would you use it? You're pitching, right? You're pitching your clinic. That's going to violate a bunch of rules that we already talked about. First one is the ice cream question, right? Because there's probably more information they need to make a decision. Just because the clinic is friendly and convenient doesn't give them the information they need, right? What type of care does it provide? Maybe they don't even care for the type of illness that I have or disease that I think I may have. It doesn't say anything about cost. It may be extremely expensive to pay for, right? So when you ask them that kind of question, you start pitching, you'll do your pitching later. If you start pitching when you're interviewing, it's going to be a big mistake. And it's probably one of the hardest rules to follow. It's hard for an entrepreneur, even in the early discovery phases, not to talk about their product. It's really what you want to do. You're excited about it, right? You want to get their reaction. That'll come next. That'll come with customer validation in the next step. It also violates the rule number 2, push versus pull, right? You're supposed to be looking to pull problems and understand them and not push them. Is this still working? All right. No, still not, I guess. Is it? Yeah. Okay. Great. And then it's probably violating a couple of the other rules. Rule number 7, we call N of few. Do people understand what N is? You can tell me what N is in an experiment. So can somebody tell me what it is? N is the number of things that are sampled. Right? Typically, you want to go for a certain sample size to get the information you're looking for. If you just do a few, you really run a risk of getting dangerous, misleading results, right? So an answer from one person or a small group of people is not adequate. So going back to the ice cream example, you were speaking to people about ice cream. One person may say, gee, I always get strawberry ice cream. Another person may say, I don't even really like ice cream. I like frozen yogurt better than ice cream. And somebody else may say, gee, I love waffle cones. I always get my ice cream in a waffle cone. So who thinks that you could succeed with an ice cream stand that only sells strawberry ice cream? Anybody? Not going to happen, right? So that would be misleading. It's a kind of a silly example in many ways, but nevertheless, an example of the type of thing that can be misleading if you don't speak to a large enough group of customers. So any one answer you get could be representative of a bigger population, but you don't know, or it could be an outlier, right? The only way to find out is to talk to more people. You don't need to achieve statistical significance here. You're not going to publish a paper, right? You're not doing a scientific controlled experiment, but you do want to keep interviewing people until you hear the same responses over and over. That tells you there's a trend. And you want to look for groupings. So you're going to hear like responses. Right? So you have cohorts. We call it customer segmentation. So you may find that there's 2 or 3 groups, and they're all different. Group they're alike. So you may want to pick one of those groups to target with your product. Rule number 8 is no seeding. This is another one that can be difficult for people. Believe it or not, you really don't want to tell the person you're interviewing any of the details of your research or why you think what you're discussing with them is important. If you do that, you're setting context. You're letting them know that you think X is important, and they're going to frame their answers around that context that you provide. So this is another one of those sort of subconscious kind of things where people just tend to want to be liked, they tend to want to please, they tend to want to give you the answers that you want to hear. So really, what you want to tell them is that I want to speak to you about your job, or I want to speak to you about opinions you have on a topic. You don't even really need to tell them why. You're just interested in learning. People love to talk about themselves. They love to talk about their jobs. They love to give opinions. So if you take this approach, you're going to get a much better response. You're not going to violate many of the other rules that we've spoken about. And this kind of leads into rule number 9, which is stories, not statements. So if you were to ask somebody, have you traveled recently? It's going to elicit probably a yes or no answer. Learn much from that. If on the other hand, you ask gee, can you tell me about your last travel experience? You're going to learn a lot more. So you really want to avoid yes/no questions, right? They don't provide deeper insights. They don't establish a rapport with the person you're speaking with. It really kind of shuts down the conversation, right? So what you'd really like to do is get them talking. So just like people like to talk about their jobs or give their opinions, people love to tell about what they've been doing otherwise. It's just travel. So it lets them lead the conversation. It reveals insights that you may not think about. So your yes/no questions may not even touch upon an important topic that you really should know about. And you're not even going to know enough to know that that exists unless you get them freely speaking about things. It will be insightful to you. So those are the 9 rules. And again, why is it important to follow these rules? Important because you get real insights. You want to have misleading results. There's research. You want to make sure you follow guidelines. You don't want bad results or worse, misleading results. So while it's very tempting to think, well, I talk to people all the time, it'll be easy for me to go out and interview customers. There really is an art to this. Well, a science partially, but also an art to doing it correctly and doing it well. Oh, this kind of summarizes everything you need to know to be successful, at least from a market de-risking perspective. So, number 1, identify who the economic buyer is. Second, identify the other users, maybe a product user, maybe a distributor, as we said, could be a vendor or other stakeholder, but identify other people that are involved. Talk to a lot of people. You know, you're going to think you know a lot, and if you talk to 1 or 2 people and they confirm what you think, you're going to say, oh, gee, I'm done. I don't need to talk to anybody else. That may just be coincidence. The next 80 people you talk to may tell you something very different. So you don't stop. And good entrepreneurs continue to do this during their whole entrepreneurship experience. So there's one group that we worked with where they talked to 1,000 people in the first year of the company. 1,000 people. Pays off. It's been rare in my companies that I've spoken to somebody and haven't learned something new. Even after I've spoken to 100, 150, 200 people, inevitably I hear a lot of the same things, but I also hear something insightful that adds a nuance or adds something that's important to potentially important to my business. What they want, right? You do this. Well, discovery. Only then validate your idea. Talk about this, but that's the next step. You go out and test your idea, validate that. Chances are you're going to find out that it's still not what the customer wants. You're going to pivot. Pivoting isn't bad. It's better than bringing the wrong product to market and having you end up in 80% of companies that fail because they failed to do this. Right? So this de-risking, this effort and time is going to bias you towards that 20% that succeed. Now, obviously, this is Eric said, you need a full business plan, you need good financials behind it. But to me, this is the foundation of entrepreneurship, right? This is the fundamental thing you need to do to avoid falling in 80% that fail. I think also, and Eric can comment on this, but I think if you go to an investor and you have a long list of customers, the names that you can provide to the investor, and they're saying they want to buy your product and why, and they're enthusiastic about it, that goes a long way. It's better than saying I have a patent. It's better than saying I built a prototype, right? I've got people knocking at the door that want to buy my product. Okay, I'm going to talk just very briefly about value proposition. Value proposition is probably one of the most difficult things to do. And if you participate in the Healer course, you'll spend a fair bit of time on value proposition. We'll spend an entire session, an hour or two, just on value proposition. Sometimes we spend 2 sessions on that. It's important to get right because it not only helps you communicate to customers, it can be a guiding principle for your business. It really says what your business is all about, what you're trying to achieve. You want to state in a value proposition sort of the clearest benefit. People tend to think, well, I've got all sorts of benefits to my product. And they want to list them off. They want this long value that goes on, or a list of features. But remember, in most cases, a feature is not value. A feature may create value for the customer. It's not value in and of itself. You want to make sure that whatever value proposition you put there clearly addresses a user need, right? And creates a case that you have the best solution for that. Why are you different? It's not easy to do in a short statement. You want to write it from the customer perspective. Kind of the push versus pull thing. In ways, you don't want to push your idea. Why you're a value, you want to have to listen to them. You want to discuss it in their terms that are meaningful to them. Clearly defines value that you provide to them if they choose to buy your product. The other thing probably to mention here in healthcare is you may need a different value proposition for users and buyers. You'll figure that out as you go out and interview potential customers, because you're going to interview both. You may find, for instance, for example, we talked about the clinic, right? Where the care provider was the user and the clinical owner is the buyer, right? They're likely going to have significantly different needs, and you may need to have a value proposition for both. But again, this is a pretty complex topic. Just wanted to roughly make you aware of things and let you know that we can help with this. So we can help you through the customer interviewing process, big part of what we do in the Healer course. Help you understand those results, help you then establish a value proposition, and then feed that into a business plan that generates economics and economic statements that are important to it. And that is the end of my presentation for today.
I started field from the survey of no market need.
Sorry, say that again.
Yes, the aspect I talk about why startups fail. Startup, why do they fail? And on the top list, we have no market need. So I want to understand if there isn't a market need, then why an entrepreneur have to take a risk?
So why does the entrepreneur take the market risk? And why do they put themselves in that position? It's a risk reward, right? You've heard that term. If you succeed and create a successful business, that's a huge accomplishment. You can help a lot of people, employ a lot of people, you create an economic benefit. So it's a typical risk reward, right? You can go play the safe route, go take a job somewhere, or if you're passionate about something and you really think you can make a difference, you become an entrepreneur. you just want to be smart about it, right? You want to do your market de-risking up front. And if you de-risk the market and you truly understand your customer, you're providing good value to them, you have a high probability of success.
So no one intentionally builds something that no one wants, right? It's not like you know that there's no market need and then you go into business. It's that you think there's a market need and you create a business around it, and then it turns out there isn't. So that's why all of this stuff that Paul was talking about not deceiving yourself, right? Asking good questions, talking to thousands of people. And at the end of the day, the best way you can figure out if there's a market need is if people start paying you. So as Paul said, if you come to me for money, let's say you want to approach me as an investor. Well, no, let me turn this around. I'm coming to you for money. And I've got two different pitches to you. One is, I've got this very cool product, and I haven't had a chance to talk to any customers yet, but I think it's very cool. The other pitch is, I've identified this problem, and I've got 50 people who want to buy it, but I don't know how to solve the problem. In the first pitch, I'm asking you for money as to how to find the customers. In the second pitch, I'm asking you for money to build the product to solve the customer's problems. Which of those two pitches would you put your money in?
So I think I rather go for the second.
Right, exactly. Because if you got customers, you de-risk the market, right? So you know, or you have confidence that there's at least some people out there who will buy your product. And as Paul identified, market risk is your number one risk. So just don't let yourself be deceived. Like, if you're interviewing customers, don't just talk to your family, because everyone wants you to exceed. Everyone loves you. Your mom will tell you it's the best thing ever. But talk to many, many real people. Not that your mom isn't real.
Paul, our friends, colleagues from the viewing room wanted you to speak a little louder.
Okay.
Thank you. My question is about how you go about speaking to these people. So, what do you think about focus groups versus direct conversations versus if you're already in business? I mean, there's multiple ways you can speak to people, right?
Sure.
So, in your experience, what do you think is the best way? Focus groups, individual market surveys, just going out, standing in public. Can I get your time briefly to ask you a question? Or if you have started already, follow ups with existing customers, maybe?
Sure. Yeah, great question. Personally, I think it's better to talk to people individually, at least initially. If you do focus groups, it takes time to organize. You find some people speak up, some people won't. Somebody has a very strong opinion and it sways other people in the room. They don't want to disagree. Particularly if you have professionals and one has a higher status than the other people in the room, they're not going to want to say anything, right? So my recommendation would be, at least at the start, just get the people individually, right? Spend the time to do that. The other thing that I think helps is the last question, typically that you always want to ask at an interview, is who else can I speak with, right? Somebody you're speaking with is in the field. They're going to know others in that field or others in a similar business or profession or have a similar disease if it's patients, right? In that daisy change, you'll go from one to the next. So always ask that as your last question.
Yeah, I'm asking. There is one thing that have been noticed. There is a fear always to start up. There is a fear because you don't really want to bring something that people will not like. Even you have done all of your survey, there is still that fear. So now, I've really been questioning myself, what will you give as possible time, a possible time within your business idea, whether it is prototyping or what period do you think can someone start up?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I personally think it's worth spending the time to interview enough customers until you hear the same thing over and over again, right? We talked about N, and a one or a few is really dangerous. So you want to speak to enough folks in enough different roles that you're hearing the same thing over and over. It's really up to you how long that takes, right? I mean, we have people who can speak to, only 2 or 3 customers a week, and it takes them, months and months to do this. Other folks will do 10, 20 interviews a week. In a month, they'll have lots of interviews. They have the data they need. Now they're much more comfortable refining their prototype. Then you can get out there with validation and assess whether or not what you think you heard and the solution you're providing truly meets their need or not. I know in some ways it sounds like it's slowing you down, that, gee, I want to just get going. I got to build this product and I got to go ask people about it, right? Very, very tempting. It's what most people do. But I can speak from experience, and not only my own experience, but the experience of entrepreneurs that we work with, that it's much more effective this way. If you rush a product out there and it's the wrong product, you're going to fail. You're going to be in that 80%. So it's a sense of false progress in many ways, unless you've done the customer discovery first. Yes. So I think the question is, how do you know whether the big enough group of people in the climate for the product is right? Yeah, that's sort of a parallel process in many ways, where you need to do some preliminary work. That's another thing we'll teach you in this class, is things happen in parallel. So you do a little bit of work in each area. You just don't want your product to get way ahead of everything else. But you are going to do some preliminary market research. You are going to look at the environment, and then you're going to make sure that you've got a viable area and that you're talking to people, like you said, in the area where there's going to be a market for a product. But if you sign up for Healer and you join in, we'll take you through that whole process and help you understand how far you go in each of the areas of marketing and product and regulatory and business and clinical.
Okay, my name is Winnie. Let's say you have this product and then you talk to a lot of people about it. You do your market survey, and then you put the product out, and you see that even though you did the market survey and more people express interest in the product, and then you put the product out and then it's not going. What can you do to be able to adjust?
So I think your question is, you can do all this market research, you put a product out there, but potentially it still may not meet their need. Is that correct? Yeah, and that's what we were trying to show with that iterative process, that slide that showed the feedback between customer discovery, validation, and then the pivot. So you have to go out and validate your idea. So it's not like you talk to a bunch of people, oh, I'm done, I've talked to 100 people, you go build your product and try to sell it. You're going to take prototypes out there. You are going to go out there and speak with people. You're going to learn more about whether or not the solution you came up with to meet the needs you heard about in customer discovery truly satisfy them in a way that's attractive to them. Most companies, as I said, pivot. It's really rare that a company, and I know this may be surprising to people, but it's pretty rare that a company goes to market with exactly the product into the market to the customer that they thought they were going to go to initially. Sometimes it's drastically different. Sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes people will go through that cycle 2 or 3 times. But, and I know it's, again, it seems like it's delaying things, and as entrepreneurs, you want to move quickly. The quick part comes in how much energy and time you put in and dedication to make this happen quickly. But avoiding it and not doing it because you think it's slowing things down is going to put you in that, potentially put you in that 80% that fail. So rushing to failure is not a great idea, right? So I'd put the time in, do the customer discovery, do the validation, be open-minded to pivoting, right? Be open-minded to changing your product idea. You may hear some real exciting things from customers. You may get more excited about an alternative product or solution than you were about your original one.
So we have, unfortunately, the last question here.
What do you do in an environment where the need exists, but the economy is not strong at the time? You know, there's a downturn. So the people have the need for the business they want to establish after all your market research and everything, but the economic forces are not there for them to pay for the product that you are putting out.
That's another great question. So the question is, what do you do if you hear about a great need, you have an excellent solution to it, but the economics aren't there? Again, you do this all in parallel. So you're trying to understand the market, some of the economics of the market. Unfortunately, there are a lot of good ideas that there are no economics for. And I think Eric gave a couple examples of those where, and he said, you know, a great product doesn't make a great business, right? Necessarily. And again, it's part of a overall process that we go through, and we could help with that. Yeah, because clearly you don't want to go to market where there's no way for the customer to pay, or the market's not big enough to support it. So it's part of the whole process. Yeah, so the comment is, gee, it sounds like there's an opportunity here to find a new payment scheme, basically, right? If the user can't pay, is there someone else who can pay? Insurance company, whoever, right? And sure, I think a lot of innovation isn't necessarily around product, it's around payment, right? Is there a payment plan you can put in place? Are there other incentives? Is there reimbursement of some sort from a government agency or from an insurance company? So yes, that's all part of the process too, to understand, you know, how you can get your product paid for and whether it makes sense to go into the business. Other questions? No? Okay, we're good. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Paul. We have a very important announcement. But just before we get to that, Simi, just stay put. Mike, you want to-
I just want to thank you all for being here and showing the interest. I also want to thank our hosts, the University of Liberia, iLab, our partner here in Liberia. Like, these are the guys, iLab are the people who are going to be here on the street talking to you day in and day out. So, like, these are the brilliant local resources that you could use. CIMMIT's going to help out, but iLab is really the anchor of this. And of course, the University of Liberia, this beautiful hall, the AC, the AV system, all of this stuff. So I just want to express our gratefulness from the CIMMIT team to all of you, to UL, to iLab, and everyone else.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you. And Mr. Dennis, thank you for being here, our business consultant. It's good to have you here. We'll now take our closing remarks. Michelle, right? Australian Systems. User mission. Let's. Oh, yes.
Good afternoon. Is this thing working? Afternoon. It seems like all have had a very good time here. I don't see anybody sleeping. Is there anybody sleeping? Give yourself a huge hand of okay. We want to say thanks to the organizers for this and to the facilitators. As I said and as I heard, you had a great time. I wasn't with you this morning because of duty, but we came in time to make sure that we had some interaction and some FaceTime with you before leaving. We from USAID are pleased that this is happening. We are more pleased to see all of you here. I was saying to Dala, wow, did you call all of these people? Say yes, more of them applied. And is you being interested in this thing is a motivation for us and for also those who took the time to come and have this time with you, especially to the women. There is a saying that says, when you educate a woman, you educate a nation. The women, as you all know, from the Bridge Youth team, is a focus here. There is an attempt to close the gender gap. I don't know what that means anyway. But in a country like Liberia, there is an attempt. There are a lot of females we see here. And we know that you all have really been interested in asking the questions. Some of you are into business. Some of you have the ideas or the innovation. Some of you have started, but you don't see yourself thriving. We are pleased to see all of you here for the women. We hope that as you leave this place, the females, we say the getcha, as you leave this place, the ideas that you got from here, the knowledge, know that it's something that will help you structure your idea for you who have the ideas. For those who already have businesses running and you don't see them thriving, I hope you learned something here that will help you make your business better. I heard one of your colleagues saying that what he learned here is that in order for you to have a successful business, you need to have a business plan. And so, as you've left here, I'm sure they drilled you through or went through how you come to even getting a business plan. So you have the idea, how do you put it on paper? How do you move it forward so that it becomes a business or it becomes a product, so to say. We hope that you, the women, will also use the ideas to help other women. All of you can be here at the same time, but the knowledge, the ideas, the experts you've learned from the experts, you will take those out there and help other women too. Most especially, we hope that all of you here will, I'm sure that there is a process for following up. All of you here that 2 years from now, 3 years from now, we will have success stories for you. Having said that, I will say again to all of you, the facilitators, we will ask all the facilitators to stand, please, the organizers and the facilitators. Please, on your, no, 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 no. We have not gone yet. The people say standing up. So all the organizers and all the facilitators, we want to give you a hand clap. It's not a regular, it's not a regular thing, right? So we have fair weather, we have rain, then we have thunder. Eh? So we have the fair weather, which you were doing before. So we want rain to come, right? Yes, rain is heavy, yeah? Thunder! 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 So the organizers, we say thank you. Thanks to all for coming, and I hope you have a good time as you go home. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Wright. Certain things can only be done better with certain people. So, Simi, want to make that special announcement.
Okay, thank you, Code. I was watching around during the lunchtime, and I saw many students and entrepreneurs striving to have conversation with the experts. But then I realized that there's a need. So since this section is over, I want to give you the opportunity to meet them, talk to them one-on-one, have that conversation on how to translate your ideas into a viable business, or if you already have existing businesses, how you can improve your skill. So that will be done into two folds. The team of advisors will go upstairs. The last door on the left, they will go in that room, and each and every one of you can, yes, okay, on your right. So you will have maximum 10 minutes to talk to them and see how you guys can improve on whatever you have. But we also have a structured program, but that could be a funnel to enter into that program. So they will go upstairs on the last room on the right, where you can have that conversation with them. But you have, again, maximum 10 minutes because we have a room full of people that would like to talk to them, so we don't want to keep everyone's waiting. So right after I put the mic down, they will head to the room, then you can park behind them. Then we also have our local partners, and that is the lab. We have our deputy director of innovation. They will have other team members that will be in the room to talk through your ideas as well. Thank you.